Lecture 1.
Hello everyone. Today I'd like to discuss what's called the three-language policy of the Indian education system. As you may or may not be aware, India is a multilingual country, and according to one estimate, there are anywhere between 700 and 1,000 languages and dialects in India. However, as you might expect, not all of these are taught in schools. But the Indian government does have a three-language policy. I'd like to talk about that today. How did the three-language policy come about? To understand this, one would have to look a little bit at the history of India, and especially this century. You might know that India was a colony of the British Empire, and it got its independence in 1947. At that time, because India was a colony of the British Empire, most of the government work was conducted in English. However, this was something that the founders of the Indian Constitution wanted to change. But they were also aware of the fact that it could not happen overnight. Or, in other words, you couldn't go overnight from conducting a government in English to conducting the duties in any Indian language. And of course, there was also the matter of which Indian language. Like I said, there were so many of them. Well, it was decided that the Indian language, which would become the official language of India, would be Hindi. And that was because 39% of the Indian population spoke Hindi. And this is the greatest number of people who spoke one language, with the second most spoken language being Bengali, which is only spoken by 8% of the population. And also, of course, it was a political decision because Hindi is also the first language of a few states which have provided most of the political leaders of India. And these were the people involved in writing the Constitution. So there was that political aspect that influenced it as well. However, as I mentioned earlier, they wanted to keep English as one as well. So it was decided that after independence, in a period of 14 years, Hindi would become the official language, but English would continue to be an associate official language of the Indian Union. This period, it was thought, would be sufficient for there to be a transition from English over to Hindi, and that's how things progressed. But when this 14-year period was about to come to an end, there was a lot of unrest in the country. In fact, people came out into the streets, and there was a lot of rioting. You might wonder why that happened. Like I said earlier, only 39% of the Indian population speaks Hindi as the first language. The rest of the population has many different languages as their first and mother language. And most of these people who have other languages as their L1 or first language are in the southern states of India. And people in these states were kind of scared at this point because they felt that they might be discriminated against in all aspects of life, especially in government jobs. If knowing Hindi would be compulsive because they would not be able to compete with Hindi speakers. So they came out onto the streets, they rioted, and they asked for a continuance of English as the associate official language of the country. Eventually, the government had to give in to their demands, and it was decreed that until further notice, English would continue to be an associate official language, and that's how it stands today. Although it has been almost another 40 years since that decision. Now, that was a little about the background of English and Hindi, and now that leads to the three-language policy of the Indian education system. Now, as you can understand, Hindi by itself could not serve the purpose of a language that could be used for communication within the country, or for running the government, or for other aspects of the country, because a lot of the population wouldn't know it. Therefore, as a result of this, the government came up with a three-language program, which states that when students graduate from school, they should know 3 languages. One of these is expected to be Hindi, the other is expected to be English, and the third language is expected to be the regional language, or the mother tongue of the area or the region in which they go to school. This policy, you might think, is quite clear-cut, and that everyone coming out of school would have these 3 languages, and there would be no problems with communication, or even in the levels of proficiency in English and Hindi, especially since these are official and associate official languages of the country. However, that is not the case. That is because the government has not laid down how many years in school children are supposed to use which language, nor has the government laid down which language is supposed to be the medium of instruction. And schools are therefore free to decide which language is to be used for the medium of instruction. This could be any of the 3 languages. The second language, which is supposed to be taught from grades 4 to 10 at least, could be any of the 3 languages. And the third language, which is supposed to be taught for a period of 3 to 4 years, could again be any of the 3 languages. So a child could come out of school, which takes a policy of teaching through English, and do his or her entire education in English, and another child could come out of another school which uses a local language as the medium of instruction, and where English is only taught for 3 or 4 years. Then these children could compete to get into the same type of universities. And that is a disadvantage for the children who have not studied English extensively, because in India, most of the higher education is conducted in English. So, although the government tried to be as inclusive as possible, and not to impose which language should be the medium of instruction, or which should be taught for whichever period of time in school, I feel that they went to the other extreme. And in doing so, they kind of disadvantaged some students. In fact, a great number of students who do not learn English for the same number of years, which some other students do, but have to compete for some similar types of areas, for example, in higher education and jobs, where they're obviously disadvantaged against students who might have studied Hindi or English for a greater number of years. So this is one problem that is continuing to face the Indian education system. But there are no easy answers to it. And that, of course, would take another lecture. Thank you.
Please answer the questions found on the internet browser for this lecture. You will have 5 minutes to complete the questions before the next lecture starts. Submit your answers, but do not go beyond the next page until the following lecture is finished. Lecture 2.
When it comes to diseases, we often develop immunity or protection against them in one of two main ways, both of which are equally effective. One of these ways is a passive way, where our body develops a natural immunity to a disease because we have been exposed to it. When we go to the doctor, we often end up getting the second type of immunity, active immunity, by getting vaccinations, which are injections of liquid that has inactive or non-disease causing viruses in it. These vaccinations are quite important in battling diseases that were previously life-threatening or caused major problems for people. For instance, if we graph the frequency of polio and measles, we can see that the introduction of vaccines almost eliminated both of these diseases. Both types of immunity are quite effective. The main difference comes with the ability to make our own immunity. But what do we really know about this? Today we're going to talk about the history of the vaccination movement and some of the challenges that have come with it. Vaccinations actually have quite a long history, dating all the way back to the 18th century. At this time, Edward Jenner, an English doctor, started to notice that exposure to cowpox, a disease that caused sores on cows, seemed to prevent individuals from getting smallpox. So Jenner decided that he would develop vaccines from cowpox, a much less serious and deadly disease than smallpox, that could be injected into people in an attempt to create immunity. With his vaccination came sharp declines in smallpox, which has been almost eliminated today, and his efforts essentially brought about the birth of the vaccine movement. After Jenner, we see an explosion of work toward creating different vaccines. In the 19th century, we see Pasteur growing rabies in the spinal cords of rabbits, which were later dried out, so the inactive virus, or a virus which could no longer cause rabies to show itself, could be put into injections. This proved to provide tremendous amounts of help in preventing rabies, a virus which previously would certainly attack the brain and kill the person who got it, by providing a means of preventing the disease from spreading if an individual was bitten by an animal that had it, thus saving countless lives. Advances in vaccine development continued into the 1930s when viruses began to be grown by scientists in cells in the laboratory. Therefore, they were able to grow viruses in dishes rather than injecting them into living things first. Therefore, viruses could be put into vaccines without having to harvest them from living animals, which required that the animals be killed. This process, originally developed by Hugh and Mary Maitland, helped to reduce the numbers of severe reactions that were seen with some of the previous vaccines that were made by growing viruses in animal tissue, which had left some people with serious health problems and had led some people to opt not to get vaccinated. It was in the 20th century that we see perhaps the quickest advancement in vaccination methods. Following Hugh and Mary Maitland's technique of growing viruses in cells in a laboratory, research in vaccination found a number of new and convenient ways to grow viruses, which made it possible to grow more viruses and more easily supply vaccines to everyone who needed them. For instance, Ernest Goodpasture found that he could use chloroallantoic membrane in an egg to grow 30 different kinds of viruses, the most common of which is measles. In fact, we still use this method for measles vaccines today. Cell cultures, or growing cells in controlled conditions, have also made it possible to adapt viruses that were previously difficult to grow for vaccines such as polio and grow them in larger quantities. In the case of polio, where the vaccines are effective 95% of the time, this was a major accomplishment. In addition, it helped to drop the cases of paralysis, or cases where individuals were unable to move parts of their body, that was caused by the polio vaccine, previously made using animal spinal cords. Finally, in recent years, we have seen researchers start to use the fetal cells in blood in order to make new vaccines. Fetal cells, or the cells of unborn babies, have been used to create new vaccines for rabies as well as for hepatitis A and rubella, two diseases that previously we could not find a way to create vaccines for prior to this new technique. Finally, the hepatitis B vaccine was developed using human blood and is the only vaccine to be developed in this way. Researchers were able to take blood from people infected with hepatitis B and purify it in such a way as to make it nothing other than hepatitis B surface proteins remained, making it impossible for people to get infected with the virus, but allowing for the immune system to recognize and prevent future infections by live viruses. This method of hepatitis B production was later discontinued when it was found that it was possible to make this vaccine using recombinant DNA procedures, which is when they take the gene from a virus and combine it with the DNA of yeast, which they use in baking bread. The gene in yeast produces the same proteins as the virus without the ability to actually infect anybody with the virus. Therefore, the proteins are taken and added to the vaccine so the immune system can learn to recognize the proteins and instantly start to fight off a hepatitis B infection should the virus actually make it into the person's system. As was discussed earlier, vaccines have proven to be very effective in lowering the number of infections caused by certain diseases. You would think that these vaccines would be welcomed by everybody then, right? Well, unfortunately, this isn't the case. While there have always been those who object to vaccination on religious or personal grounds, we have seen a shocking rise in the number of other people who support the anti-vaccination movement recently. These anti-vaccination opinions have arisen due to a study conducted by Dr. Andrew Wakefield in 2003 that found a supposed link between vaccines and autism, a behavioral disorder. The study was picked up by celebrities such as Jenny McCarthy and has therefore caused a large increase in the anti-vaccine movement and a rise in suspicion toward what people call big pharma, or the major pharmaceutical companies that produce the different vaccinations for the public. However, these claims have been found to have no basis because Dr. Wakefield's data was found to be fabricated and the interpretation of the data was biased. A series of studies conducted since then have all found the opposite, that there is no link between vaccines and autism. Even though this has been the case, suspicion still continues, and the anti-vaccine movement continues to gain members, leading some parents to choose not to vaccinate their children. This not only endangers those children by making them susceptible to dangerous illnesses, but also others that are exposed to these children, even those who have been vaccinated. Why is this, you might ask? How can I or others be endangered if I've been vaccinated? Well, there are two major reasons for this. First, some people cannot be vaccinated because they have allergic reactions to certain vaccines. So they rely on others being vaccinated to help prevent their illnesses. And second, vaccines are never 100% effective. So even if you do get vaccinated, there's a slight chance that you may still catch the disease. So we often rely on everybody getting vaccinated in order to keep this chance down as much as possible. If groups of people don't get vaccinated and then catch the disease, then it is more likely that you will catch it, even if you have been vaccinated. We need only to look at recent events to see proof for this. Whooping cough and measles, two diseases that were near to being wiped out, have recently come back in epidemic proportions due to lack of vaccination. How this will play out in the future is a mystery. Recent court cases have stated that parents are required to vaccinate their children, but these are still being fought further. We will discuss this more in our next class, though.
Please answer the questions found on the internet browser for this lecture. You will have 5 minutes to complete the questions before the next lecture starts. Submit your answers, but do not go beyond the next page until the following lecture is finished. Lecture 3.
Today we're going to talk about the Dada art movement. If you think Dada sounds like a word that has been made up, then you're correct. The term Dada is a nonsense word. It has no meaning at all. We don't know what the origins of the term are, but we can trace the art movement back to its start. Prior to World War I in Europe, there was a sense of rationality, of order. And at this time, everything was viewed as stable and following rules. And much of this can be seen in the painting of the time. However, once World War I came and went, many Europeans found their world had been changed. Millions of men died in the war and cities were destroyed. Europeans had never seen destruction like this before, and now they questioned the culture of rationality and order that they had previously been so willing to accept prior to the outbreak of war. Because of this, the time following the war became known as the Age of Disillusionment, or a time when people were disappointed that the world was not how they actually thought it was. So how does all of this relate to the Dada art movement? Well, because of the war and the way it flipped culture on its side, many artists began to push art's boundaries. They started to create paintings that were meant to display the sense of absurdity that had appeared. The artwork was absurd in that it was meant to shock the public by presenting the ridiculous and absurd concepts that the Dada artists sought to paint. So you can see that Dada artists rejected reason or rational thought. Because of the war, they no longer believed that rational thought would help to solve social problems and that a new type of thinking was required. Let's take two artists as examples, Marcel Duchamp and Salvador Dali. Duchamp was very much the pioneer of the Dada movement. He was originally a painter and after the war stopped painting and turned to making sculptures that he referred to as ready-made. They most likely got that name because they were made from readily available materials. For instance, one such sculpture was made of a stool attached to a bicycle wheel at the top. At this time, many people reacted to such works of Dadaism negatively. They found the art of the movement to be distasteful and outrageous. Many of them didn't think that the works were art at all. That's how far they were from the previous conceived culture and rationality. You would think this would discourage Duchamp and other Dadaists, but actually this is what they wanted. With the rise of Dada art, they were actually seeking to produce non-art or anti-art. They actually sought to disregard all rules previously made under the culture of rationality. In addition to these sculptures, Duchamp would also try to take established cultural standards and try to challenge them through other works. One way he did this was to take works of the great painters of the past and edit them. One such work that some of you might be familiar with is one called LHOOQ. In this painting, he actually took a reproduction or a print of Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa and drew a mustache and beard on her face. In doing so, he was disrespecting a treasured painting of the past that has even to this day been held in high regard, receiving praise from many people. Such disrespect was an important characteristic which characterized much of Duchamp's work and the early Dada movement. But what about other artists? How did they represent this movement? As the Dada movement started to gain momentum and popularity, you could see influences from the outside of the art world show themselves. One strong influence was Sigmund Freud, a psychiatrist from Austria who published a series of essays on the subconscious and the interpretation of dreams prior to the start of World War I. At first thought, you might think, well, what does psychiatry have to do with the art movement? But you have to remember that the Dada movement rested in the absurd, and as it advanced, its members began to focus on the more surreal and subconscious characteristics of human nature as a means for freeing human imagination and creativity. The free association technique associated with Freud allowed artists to draw whatever came into their mind, allowing for a direct connection with their subconscious. They believed that this would help to free people from the rationalism and logicality that had trapped them and led to the war. In a way, they believed that this was more effective for promoting social change than directly attacking the social conventions of the day, as Duchamp had been doing. This brings us to another great artist of the period, Salvador Dali. Salvador Dali is actually probably the best example of this new Dadaism. Starting out in the Cubist tradition under Pablo Picasso, Dali soon became interested in Freud's ideas, which ultimately led to a change in his artistic style and ended up fully embracing surrealism in his work. Now, as I said, the new Dadaism stopped attacking cultural norms and started focusing on freeing people through free association techniques, which is basically when you write or draw whatever comes to mind without stopping it from happening. Dali's paintings show this in that the subject matter is almost dreamlike in appearance. For instance, one of his most famous paintings, called The Persistence of Memory, presents the viewer with a picture that is full of melting clocks, representing that time is not a rigid concept. It is actually dependent on the person experiencing it. Looking closer at the painting, one can also see ants on a pocket watch, which Dali often used to symbolize decay in his work. In this painting, in this instance, they were used to show the decay of typical conventions or ideas of what time is. The painting further shows the colors blue, yellow, and brown, colors Dali often used to represent his home country, Spain. The way that this painting was made is meant to help the viewer to step inside the dreams of an artist and, by doing so, to open up the viewer's imagination and, in this way, rethink the cultural norms of the day. While Dali did not directly challenge culture and social norms through his painting as Duchamp did, he did paint with the purpose of encouraging individual imagination by freeing it from the chains of conservative Victorian ideals. As you might recall, I mentioned that Dali started in the Cubist tradition, which was characterized as being rational, ordered, and logical. It is interesting to note here that even though he started out in the Cubist tradition, Dali began to attack the work of Cubists, such as Pablo Picasso, who he initially respected and wanted to work with in his early years. Nobody really knows for certain why he suddenly started doing this, but many have speculated some of the reasons, with many looking at the different ideologies of the two movements. So basically, we have this movement in art that sought to find ways to deal with the fallout from World War I by both challenging the cultural norms that preceded the war and that many thought were a direct cause for the conflict, as well as by promoting more freedom of thought as a way of moving away from conservative thought toward more open-minded views. While this art movement essentially ended at the start of the Second World War, its influences still continue today and provide a starting point for the abstract expressionist movement that followed, with many of the best modern artists showing Dada characteristics in their artwork. Few movements in art history can claim to have such a far-reaching effect on art as we know it. But this is something we will go into in more detail in our next lecture.
Please answer the questions found on the internet browser for this lecture. You will have 5 minutes to complete the questions before the next lecture starts. Submit your answers, but do not go beyond the next page until the following lecture is finished.